Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Thanksgiving always looked the same in our family. Polished smiles stretched a little too tight, the table set with perfect linen napkins no one dared to use, and the scent of roasted turkey hanging in the air like a smokescreen to cover the tension crackling just beneath the surface. My mother had been fussing over the gravy since 9 in the morning. My father was already on his second glass of bourbon by the time we sat down, and my brother Nick, well, Nick never missed an opportunity to make sure everyone in the room knew he was doing better than the rest of us. The clinking of forks and the murmur of idle conversation filled the dining room, but the undercurrent was familiar, an unspoken competition disguised as tradition. Everyone came dressed in their best versions of themselves, armed with anecdotes about promotions, vacation homes, new investments, and kids' report cards like trophies being paraded around for praise. I took my seat at the far end of the table, same as always, the extra chair squeezed between the buffet and the coat rack, like a subtle reminder of where I belonged in the family hierarchy. Nick sat dead center, basking in the glow of attention like it was stage lighting, delivering a monologue about his latest market win, complete with numbers, percentages, and smug nods from Dad, who barely blinked when I walked into the room. I knew the scene. I'd been cast in the same supporting role year after year, the quiet sister with the vague career and no real accomplishments to speak of, at least not the kind they understood. I never bothered correcting them anymore. It was easier to let them believe I was still floundering somewhere in the gray area between underemployment and daydreaming. I was swirling my wine, half listening to Nick describe how his bonus this year was going to be just shy of 6 figures, when he looked up and locked eyes with me, a half-smile curling across his face like he'd just remembered I was there. "So, how's the little business going?" he asked, tone deliberately casual, but his words dripping with that same old condescension he'd perfected since we were teenagers. "Still chasing clients, or did you finally find a real job?" The chuckle that followed wasn't even subtle. It was bait, plain and sharp, cast across the table in front of our parents and extended relatives like it was part of the entertainment. I could feel my mother's eyes slide toward me, waiting to see how I'd react, probably hoping I'd just smile and laugh it off like I always did. But I didn't. Not this time. I didn't bite, didn't snap, didn't even flinch. I simply took another sip of my wine, met Nick's gaze, and gave the smallest shrug, like his words weighed absolutely nothing. What none of them knew, not Nick, not my mother, not even the cousins whispering to each other near the end of the table, was that I had already closed a deal earlier that morning that would make his bonus look like a rounding error. But I hadn't come to Thanksgiving to brag. I came with something far more satisfying in mind. That morning had started like any other day in my world: too many emails, an overbooked schedule, and a final client call that had been hanging in the air for weeks. Ava, my business partner, had called just after sunrise, her voice sharp with adrenaline. "It's done," she said. "They signed. All 3 departments. Full contract. We're in." It wasn't just any deal. It was a corporate restructuring package for one of the most powerful finance firms in the state, Nick's firm. What he didn't know was that our company had been bidding for that contract behind the scenes for months, quietly crafting a proposal so airtight it made the competition look like amateurs. What he also didn't know was that I'd been working directly with his boss, Adam Stokes, for the past 4 weeks, negotiating terms and finalizing deliverables. I leaned back in my chair and let Nick keep talking, let him continue his parade of numbers and stock tips, because I knew what was coming. I knew who was about to walk through that door. And I knew that when he did, everything about how this family saw me, everything they thought they knew, was about to unravel. I wasn't here just for the turkey. I wasn't here to play the background character again. I came to end something. I don't remember the exact moment I realized I had been born into a supporting role in my own family's production, but somewhere between the school assemblies and the college acceptance letters that never came for me, the truth settled in like an unwanted houseguest that never left. My brother Nick had always been the star, bigger, louder, faster, shinier. The kind of kid who got a trophy just for showing up, and if he didn't, someone would invent one just so he could take something home. He was the golden boy before he could even spell the word ambition, and our parents never missed a chance to polish him up and parade him around like he was proof that their parenting had worked. I used to think I could catch up, that maybe if I just tried harder or smiled wider or got straight A's in enough classes, they'd look at me the way they looked at him. But it was never about trying. It was about who they decided we were from the start, and I was always cast as the one who had potential but lacked direction, while Nick was the one they called driven, before he even had a driver's license. He played varsity football, wore tailored suits to high school career days, and talked about stocks before he ever earned a paycheck. Meanwhile, I was doodling in sketchbooks and writing poetry on napkins, trying to find meaning in a world that kept telling me I wasn't built for the big leagues. Our parents never said it outright, but their disappointment had a tone, a sigh in their voice, a glance passed across the dinner table, a forced smile that always arrived a second too late. "Nick's going to be a CEO one day," my dad would say, chest puffed out, voice full of certainty. "You should really find a nice man to marry," my mom would add, her hand patting mine like that was the best thing I could hope for. Every word they spoke came wrapped in the kind of encouragement that sounded more like a warning: stay small, don't dream too loud, and for God's sake, don't embarrass us by aiming too high. When Nick got into business school, they threw a dinner party. When I got a scholarship to an arts program, they sent a text that said, "Congrats, I guess." He came home with stories about internships at banks and hedge funds and mentors with private jets. I came home with calloused fingers from painting sets at theater school and stories about late-night rehearsals that no one wanted to hear. Every milestone I reached felt like it came with a footnote: less impressive, less serious, less important. Eventually, I stopped trying to impress them. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because I got tired of being measured against a ruler I didn't help make. I started building a life that made sense to me, one piece at a time, even if they didn't notice. I took freelance gigs, started designing digital content for small businesses, launched projects that barely paid rent but fed my soul in a way their praise never did. I found my rhythm outside of their spotlight, and even when I stumbled, even when the money was tight and the days were long, I kept going. Because I wasn't chasing their approval anymore, I was chasing my own sense of purpose. Still, it's strange how those early years stick to your bones like old wallpaper, how the roles we're assigned in childhood can echo so loudly into adulthood. Sometimes I still hear my father's voice in my head, saying, "Nick's a natural leader," while I sat 3 feet away, wondering what that made me. Sometimes I still feel that twitch of envy when I see how easily Nick slips into every room like he owns it, how the world seems to open for him with half the effort it ever took me. But those moments are fleeting now, ghosts of a script I no longer follow. Let me ask you something. Have you ever grown up in a family where you felt like the supporting actor in someone else's success story? Have you ever watched a sibling get showered in praise while you had to fight just to be seen? Have you ever been told, in so many subtle ways, that your dreams weren't serious, that your work wasn't real, that your worth was somehow conditional on someone else's spotlight? If you have, I want you to know you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me how you broke free, or how you're still fighting to. Because the thing they didn't know was that while they were applauding Nick's every move and patting themselves on the back for raising a future titan of industry, I was slowly, quietly, relentlessly building something they couldn't even begin to imagine. Not for their approval, not for their attention, but for myself. And I never stopped building. There's a particular kind of silence that comes from being ignored, not the peaceful, restful silence that lets you breathe and think, but the heavy, oppressive kind that settles in your chest and whispers, "You don't matter." I lived in that silence for years, scraping by on freelance gigs that barely paid enough to cover rent, juggling side jobs that left me too tired to think, let alone dream. While Nick was out closing deals and attending company retreats in Napa Valley, I was babysitting during the day and copy editing spreadsheets for local businesses at night, just trying to stay afloat long enough to find a way forward. I remember one winter where I had so little money that I rationed groceries, lived off instant oatmeal and canned beans, and learned how to stretch a $20 bill into an entire week's worth of meals. My boots had holes in them, my heat barely worked, and I worked from a refurbished laptop that shut down every time I opened more than 3 tabs. But I didn't complain. I didn't run back home asking for help. I just kept going day after day because I believed in something even if I didn't quite know what it was yet. The truth is, people like me don't get offered blueprints. No one hands us a guide on how to build something from the ground up. We have to figure it out one scraped knee and sleepless night at a time. I took every gig I could find, designing flyers for local yoga studios, editing blog posts for food truck owners, even ghostwriting speeches for real estate agents who couldn't string a sentence together. I took pride in every task, even the ones that felt beneath me, because every dollar I earned brought me one step closer to something bigger. It wasn't until I met Camilla that things began to change. She was one of those women you notice the moment she walks into a room, not because she's loud, but because she doesn't have to be. She ran a boutique consulting agency that specialized in corporate transformations, and we met entirely by accident at a networking event I almost didn't attend because I couldn't afford the cab fare. I remember standing awkwardly near the coffee table, pretending to be engrossed in the event pamphlet, when she struck up a conversation about the bitter taste of the espresso. What started as small talk turned into a 20-minute conversation about storytelling, branding, and strategy, and by the end of it, she handed me her card and told me to call her the next day. That phone call turned into an unpaid internship, and that internship turned into a mentorship that would end up changing my life. Camilla didn't sugarcoat anything. She threw me into the deep end. Late-night strategy meetings, brutal client reviews, deadlines that felt impossible, but she also taught me how to swim. She taught me how to own a room, how to pitch an idea without blinking, how to turn rejection into research and mistakes into lessons. She pushed me harder than anyone ever had, and for the first time in my life, someone believed in what I could build, not just what I could endure. When I landed my first real client, I cried in the bathroom for 10 minutes before I even signed the contract. It wasn't a massive company or a glamorous gig, but it was mine, earned with grit, not handed with a handshake. That first check felt like a miracle, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented, proof that I wasn't crazy for believing in myself when no one else did. And from there, it snowballed. Clients started referring me. Word spread. Camilla eventually brought me on as a partner in the agency, and within a year, we were taking on high-level corporate clients that I had only dreamed of working with before. And yet, back home, the narrative never changed. To my family, I was still the one, trying to figure things out, the one with some kind of creative business, whatever that meant. They never asked for details. They never tried to understand what I actually did. And honestly, I let them stay ignorant, not because I was ashamed, but because I was saving the truth for a moment that would mean something. I wanted them to keep underestimating me, to keep laughing quietly behind my back at family dinners and telling people I was freelancing, like it was just a cute little side hustle I'd outgrow someday. I didn't need their applause anymore, but I did want them to really see what I had built while they weren't paying attention. Not because I craved revenge, but because there's a certain satisfaction in letting the truth speak for itself. Because eventually, the truth always walks through the door, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a contract no one expected. And then came the client I took for a reason no one saw coming. By the time the turkey had been carved and the second round of mashed potatoes passed around the table, Nick had officially taken over the entire conversation with the kind of ease only someone raised on applause could manage. He sat at the head of the table like a king, leaning back in his chair with a smug half-smile, spinning stories about quarterly growth, profit margins, and client acquisition like he was hosting a business seminar rather than Thanksgiving dinner. He tossed out acronyms and financial jargon like confetti, clearly enjoying the way our parents clung to every word as if he were revealing state secrets rather than just parroting his company's latest report. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a little louder than necessary, "our firm just wrapped one of the biggest portfolio restructurings in our division's history." I was lead consultant on that one, naturally. The executive team basically said I carried the whole thing on my back. He paused long enough to take a sip of wine and glance toward our father, who beamed with pride like Nick had just won a Nobel Prize. They're even floating my name for a promotion. Might be heading up a new department by next quarter. The room hummed with polite admiration, forks clinking against plates, a few cousins nodding with vacant expressions like they barely understood what he was saying but knew it was supposed to be impressive. My mother leaned in and patted Nick's arm, her smile glowing with maternal pride, and said, "I always knew you'd go far. You've just got that business mind, you know? You were born for this." I stayed quiet, cutting my sweet potato casserole in perfect squares, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew what was coming, and the anticipation was far sweeter than anything on that table. What struck me most wasn't Nick's need to gloat. That wasn't new. What stung, in a way that I had grown used to but never quite numb to, was the way our parents responded. Not once did my mother glance my way during Nick's grand monologue. Not once did my father ask me how my business was going, not even a sideways nod of acknowledgement. I may as well have been invisible, sitting right there between the cranberry sauce and the basket of cornbread, watching a performance I wasn't invited to participate in. But I didn't mind. Not this time. Because while they were all leaning in toward Nick, basking in the glow of his self-congratulation, I was watching the clock. I knew the moment was close. I'd timed it perfectly. Right on cue, there was a knock at the front door, 3 firm, deliberate taps that cut clean through the laughter and the scraping of plates. My mother stood up quickly, startled but composed, brushing invisible crumbs from her blouse as she rushed to the door, clearly confused but too polite to question it aloud. "I wasn't expecting anyone else," she muttered, opening the door with the kind of rehearsed hospitality she reserved for neighbors or church friends. And there he was, Adam Stokes, Nick's boss. Tall, sharp-suited, and exuding the quiet kind of authority that doesn't need introduction. My mother blinked twice, clearly recognizing him from the company holiday photo Nick once proudly displayed on the fridge, but unsure why he was here, standing in her foyer with a smile and a bottle of wine in hand. "Adam," Nick said, half rising from his chair, eyebrows raised in shock. "What are you? How did you?" Adam stepped into the dining room like he'd been there 100 times before, offering polite nods to the family, shaking hands as if this were just another stop on his social calendar. Then he saw me. "Ah," he said warmly, eyes lighting up as he walked straight past Nick and toward my end of the table. "There she is. I was hoping I'd catch you here." Before anyone could say a word, he leaned down slightly and said with genuine admiration, "You absolutely killed it today. That deal was brilliant. Seriously, flawless execution. My team's still talking about it." I smiled, calm and easy, while the entire table froze in stunned silence. You could practically hear the whirring of confusion in Nick's brain, trying to piece together what he'd just heard, trying to convince himself he must have misunderstood. Adam continued talking, complimenting the negotiation strategy, referencing very specific details that only someone deeply involved in the deal would know, and casually mentioning how excited he was to see where our partnership would go next. My father's jaw had gone slack, and my mother looked like someone had dropped ice water into her lap. Nick's face drained of color as realization crept in, slow and sharp, like a paper cut you don't notice until it stings. He tried to laugh, a brittle sound that cracked under the weight of his confusion. "Wait, what do you mean partnership?" he asked, voice shaky. Adam turned to him, a bit puzzled, then nodded. "Oh, you didn't know?" She's the lead consultant on the entire restructure. Her firm's running point on the whole transition. Honestly, we'd be lost without her. And that was the moment Nick realized, he works for me. It didn't happen overnight, and it definitely didn't happen by accident. The deal that flipped my entire life on its axis wasn't some stroke of luck or divine timing. It was calculated, deliberate, and more personal than anyone could have guessed. It started, like most opportunities do, with a problem no one else was willing to touch. A problem so layered, so tangled in ego and outdated systems, that most consultants turned it down flat. But I saw it differently. I saw an opening, a fracture in the glass, a place where everything could either collapse or be rebuilt into something better. I chose to rebuild it, and I made damn sure I was the only one who could. The company had been struggling in silence for years, bleeding money behind boardroom doors while maintaining a polished front for their investors and clients. But the whispers were growing louder: layoffs, missed targets, internal chaos, and I knew, from the moment I read their first inquiry, that this was the kind of deal that would change everything. What made it even more interesting, more twisted and poetic, was that it was the same firm my brother had been bragging about for years. His crown jewel. His golden ticket. The place he walked into every morning like he owned it, unaware of the rot growing beneath the surface. When Adam Stokes, the CEO himself, reached out through a private referral and asked to meet discreetly, I played it cool. I didn't show my hand. I didn't let on that I already knew the company inside and out, or that I had been quietly studying their internal structures, mapping their weaknesses, watching their stock trends like a hawk. I went into that meeting calm and sharp, armed with a 10-page proposal that didn't just diagnose their problems, it offered solutions no one else had dared to suggest. What followed was a month of brutal negotiations, late-night phone calls, and strategy sessions that pushed me further than any project ever had. Every move was a chess play, every sentence carefully chosen, every document sharpened like a blade. There were moments I thought it might fall apart, moments I questioned whether I was pushing too hard or risking too much. But deep down, I knew exactly what I was doing. This wasn't just another client. This wasn't just another project. This was the client. The one that would put my business on the map and shift the entire power dynamic of my family without a single word spoken. When the final signatures were collected and the ink dried on the contract, Ava and I stood in our office staring at the signed document in silence. She looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "Do they know?" I shook my head and smiled. Not yet. But they will. Because I hadn't told a soul, not my parents, not my friends, not even Ava, until the final moments. I kept it locked up tight because I didn't want anyone to ruin the quiet satisfaction of unveiling it exactly when I intended to. Within 3 weeks, our firm was inside the walls of their company, dismantling old frameworks, restructuring teams, rebranding services, and implementing new systems from the ground up. We weren't just consulting, we were reshaping the foundation of their entire business model. And in that process, we became indispensable. The kind of indispensable that makes other companies come calling, asking for meetings, offering proposals, begging for even a piece of our time. Before I knew it, we weren't just managing one firm, we were influencing 5. Our strategies reached across the industry like threads in a web, linking us quietly but powerfully to decision-making tables I'd never even dreamed of sitting at. My brother, still oblivious to the bigger picture, was just another cog in a machine I now had the keys to. And I didn't say a word. I didn't brag. I didn't post a thing on social media or bring it up in casual conversation. I waited. I waited for the right moment, the one that would mean something, the one where the truth could speak louder than any speech I could ever give. That moment came at the Thanksgiving table, when Adam sat back in his chair, looked around at the stunned faces, and said, without a hint of sarcasm, "She's one of the sharpest minds in the game right now. You have no idea how lucky we are to have her on board." The silence that followed was the loudest applause I'd ever received. My mother cleared her throat, trying to hide the tremble in her voice. My father looked like he'd swallowed his own pride and couldn't quite get it down. And Nick, poor Nick, he just sat there blinking, replaying every sentence in his head, trying to find a version of the story where he still came out on top. But I didn't take this client just for the money. After the dishes had been cleared and the conversations had thinned into awkward silences and half-hearted attempts at small talk, Nick found me alone near the side hallway, standing by the old oak cabinet where our mother kept the linen napkins she only pulled out twice a year. His footsteps were hesitant, not like the confident strides he usually took when he entered a room expecting applause, but slower, more cautious, like he was walking towards something he couldn't quite name yet, but knew he couldn't ignore. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, jaw clenched, arms crossed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like he was trying to balance something invisible. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't angry the way I expected. It was low, brittle, like it had been scraped raw. "You could have told me," he said, not looking directly at me. You could have said something. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the towering older brother I'd grown up under. I saw a man suddenly unsure of everything he thought he knew, struggling to make sense of the story he'd been telling himself for years. You didn't want to know, I said softly, not with bitterness, just truth. You never asked, Nick. You just assumed. He looked at me then, and his eyes weren't full of superiority or mockery like they used to be. They were full of confusion, of the kind of disorientation that comes from realizing the world isn't built the way you thought it was. So what? He asked, the frustration starting to rise again, trying to mask the shame underneath. Was this some kind of plan? Some revenge fantasy you've been waiting to pull off? I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was such a perfect illustration of how he still thought everything revolved around him. It wasn't about you, I said, my voice steady now, grounded in something deeper than spite. It never was. I didn't build my company to prove anything to you. I didn't sign your boss's firm just to get a reaction. I did it because I knew I could. Because I needed to prove something to myself, that I could rise on my own terms, without anyone paving the road for me or handing me a damn blueprint. He looked away again, jaw tightening, and I could tell he was trying to hold on to his pride, trying to keep his balance in a room where the ground had shifted beneath him. You always thought you were the only one who worked hard, he said quietly. You think I didn't earn what I have? No, I said honestly. I think you worked hard. I just think you always had someone cheering you on while I had to build in silence. You got applause for walking across a stage. I had to climb up the back steps in the dark and hope no one saw me fall. He didn't have a response for that. Not right away. He just nodded slowly, like a man finally realizing the silence around him wasn't empty. It had just been filled with voices he never bothered to listen to. There was a long pause between us then, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a fight. It felt like something quieter, more honest, more uncertain. Finally, he asked, did you plan this? His voice was almost a whisper now, like he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. I smiled, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just gently. Sometimes things line up exactly how they're meant to, I said. And that was all I gave him. Because he didn't need to know how many nights I stayed up crafting that proposal, how many versions I wrote before sending it to his boss, or how many times I rehearsed keeping my face blank at the dinner table just so I could savor the moment when everything turned. That part of the story was mine and mine alone. As I turned to grab my coat and head toward the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out without urgency, glancing at the screen the way you do when you're no longer surprised by good news. It was a message from another executive, one I'd pitched to 3 months earlier and hadn't heard back from until now. We're impressed, the message read. We'd like to offer you a seat on our advisory board. Let's talk next week. I didn't react. I didn't show the message to anyone. I just tucked the phone back in my coat pocket, stepped outside into the cool night air, and breathed in the quiet satisfaction of a victory that didn't need fireworks to feel powerful. Behind me, I knew Nick was still standing in that hallway, still replaying the evening in his head, still trying to reassemble the pieces of a narrative that no longer made sense. He would recover, of course, he always did, but something had shifted, and we both knew it. Not just in him, but in the story our family had always told about who we were and what we were worth. Because I didn't just win tonight. I rewrote the story they kept trying to tell about me.